It's not many young boys who can lay claim to their very own castle. But when I was growing up in the Scottish borders, this place was my playground. It was built by a man once known as the Wizard of the North. And to me his shadowy creation certainly seemed enchanted. It was only later I discovered it was magical as well. I remember first visiting here when I was 8 years old and looking up at these two shields here, one with my name, Stuart, emblazoned on it, and the other painted with the name of my younger brother Douglas. I didn't realise then that they referred to Clan Douglas and the House of Stuart, the Kings of Scotland, until 1688. For a small boy with a big imagination, it seemed as if there was some kind of supernatural connection between me and this house. In fact, for many years after that, I was convinced that one day I'd probably end up living here. Of course, it was all part of the fantasy. But then fantasy is what makes this place. Abbotsford House was built by Sir Walter Scott, mythmaker, inventor of history, and the 19th century's best-selling author. But I knew Abbotsford long before I knew Scott. It's to my shame that I didn't read his novels, non-fiction and poetry until my 20s. Like many Scots of my generation, I think I was slightly embarrassed by the shortbread tin stereotype, the tartan-trimmed phony Caledonia that I thought Scott had invented. But when, at last, I finally did read his books, I discovered something that completely changed my view, not just of the man, but of this marvellous, madcap house he built. Abbotsford is reopening to the public after an extensive refurbishment that returns the building to how it was in Scott's lifetime. 13,000 treasures that Scott collected for his Conundrum Castle are being unwrapped and put back in place, ready for the big day. That work has revealed even more secrets about this house built by books. When I first came to Abbotsford, I cared more about Doctor Who than 19th century fiction. And yet, Abbotsford is a kind of crashed TARDIS, where the past, present and future are deliriously jumbled together. It's just a few hectic weeks before the reopening of Abbotsford House, and one of its most evocative treasures is being unpacked. Scott's own writing desk. It's just a small mahogany piece of furniture, rather unprepossessing actually. But it witnessed the birth of quite an extraordinary output. This desk saw the creation of 12 volumes of poetry, 32 volumes of non-fiction, literally tens of thousands of letters, and 48 volumes of novels, including Waverley, Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, and my personal favourite, Redgauntlet. Scott was the best-selling author of his day, the 19th century equivalent, if you like, of J.K. Rowling. He was published everywhere from Edinburgh to London, India to America, and translated into French, Swedish, Italian, and even Mohawk. Abbotsford was not just the crucible for this astonishing outpouring of work. It was a work of art in its own right. As Scott himself said, it was a romance in stone and line. Abbotsford is a palace and a paradox. It's the creative expression of a distinctly Scottish split personality. Born in Edinburgh in 1771, Walter Scott was a man divided between two worlds. At the end of the 18th century, the Scottish capital was fizzing with new ideas, new philosophies, and a new sense of reason. A trained lawyer, Scott was very much a man of the Enlightenment. But he was also a romantic, drawn to the old Gothic ballads and ancient supernatural stories of the countryside around the River Tweed, where he spent much of his childhood, and where he eventually built Abbotsford. During the recent renovation work on the building, the workmen made an intriguing discovery. If I just prise up this temporary cover, let me show you. It's a well. This is the last remnant of the original building which stood on this site, a set of dilapidated farm cottages, known locally as Clarty Hole, Clarty meaning dirty. When Scott bought the property in 1811, he immediately renamed it Abbotsford, far more romantic than Clarty Hole. I think it's oddly moving there's this secret well hidden at the heart of Abbotsford. If Abbotsford is anything, it's a wellspring, a place where the past continually bubbles up, where nothing can be hidden forever. And it chimes exactly with the kind of stories Scott told in this place that he called his flibberty-gibbet of a house. The past is always present in Abbotsford and in Scott's work. This is a place where skulls are mantelpiece ornaments and suits of armour are the decor of choice. It's a box of yesterdays, a cabinet of curiosities, a surrealist cut-up. Scott didn't conceive of Abbotsford just as a home. It was a museum, a reliquary where the glories of the past were enshrined in the present. This eccentric house wasn't just where the past came alive, it was where the past stayed alive. This is how crazy Abbotsford is as a house. It's the kind of place you've got to go out of a window when you're trying to find a door. This is the door of the old Tolbooth prison from Edinburgh. Scott managed to salvage it when the building was being demolished. It's a great example of how he literally incorporated the past into Abbotsford. And he didn't just build it into his home, he built it into his novels too. It's here in the heart of Midlothian, the novel which takes its title from the nickname for that notorious prison. "That seems a very strong door," said Sir George. "It is so, sir," said Butler, "but it was my misfortune at one time to see it prove greatly too weak." In his novels, Scott didn't just describe historical events, he inhabited history as much as he did this house. His characters are all formed by history. History is the hidden character in all his books. It was this that inspired everyone from Dickens to Tolstoy, and which decisively shaped how his own home country imagined itself. Scott invented Scotland, from the ballads he collected that would otherwise have been lost, through to the narrative poems where he described the Trossachs, the Borders and the Isles, to the novels where he showed how the Act of Union, the Jacobite Rebellion, even the rise of spa towns changed what it meant to be Scottish. O Caledonia, stern and wild, meet nurse for a poetic child, land of brown heath and shaggy wood, land of the mountain and the flood. Land of my sires, what mortal hand can e'er untie the filial band that knits me to thy rugged strand? But it wasn't just Scotland. It's sometimes forgotten that Scott wrote many novels set in England as well, And it's in those books we get such famous stories as Walter Raleigh putting down his cloak for Elizabeth to cross a puddle, or Robin Hood splitting the Sheriff of Nottingham's arrow in the centre of the bullseye. Scott created a version of history where Jacobites and Hanoverians, or Cavaliers and Roundheads, or Saxons and Normans could clash, and out of that clash create something better. Scott's most audacious piece of national myth-making came in 1822, when he stage-managed the visit of George IV to Edinburgh. Scott even persuaded the king to wear a kilt for the occasion. Quite an irony given within living memory, rebellious Highlanders had tried to overthrow the royal family. Satirists might have poked fun at the fat king, but Scott's coup de théâtre sparked a rage for all things Highland. Scott created many of our national myths, and he did so with a theatrical panache that proved wildly popular not just in Britain, but abroad. This is rare footage of the early silent film Ivanhoe, one of two cinematic versions of the novel made in 1913, and one of the first American movies to film on location in Britain. Scott's action-packed historical extravaganzas were perfect fodder for dramatic adaptation. His work spawned over 4,000 movies, TV series, stage plays, and operas. Wander around Abbotsford and you discover a similarly theatrical quality. Scott never meant Abbotsford to be a po-faced and precise replica of a medieval castle. He meant it to be a stage set. Nothing is quite as it seems. Take, for example, this ceiling. It looks like a carved medieval wooden ceiling. In fact, parts of it are copied from Rosslyn Chapel, made so famous by the Da Vinci Code. But it's not a genuine piece of the past. It's made of wood pulp and plaster and glue, moulded and painted to look like wood. For Scott, the term artificial was the highest form of praise. He may have been besotted with the past, but that didn't mean it had to be pure or even authentic. Despite, or maybe because of, the larger-than-life quality of Abbotsford, it had a huge influence on architectural style. For its Victorian admirers, Abbotsford provided a vision of a chivalric past, far removed from the perplexing realities of the industrial present. It spawned a whole host of imitators, including that model of feudal nostalgia, Balmoral Castle. But Abbotsford isn't all gleeful pastiche and phony medievalism. Scott enjoyed all the benefits of modern industry as well. He had one eye fixed on the past, but the other was looking to the future. I love this. This is one of the pneumatic servant bells that Scott had installed. Basically, you pushed it, and somewhere in the bowels of the building, a little pop gun would go off to summon a servant. Abbotsford, when it was built, was the most technologically sophisticated home in Scotland. It wasn't just pneumatic servants' bells. It had central heating, gas lighting, and even flushing lavatories. Abbotsford was steampunk before steampunk was invented, a combination of nostalgia and cutting-edge technology. The same features can be found in his novels. In Tales of the Crusaders, he imagined a steam-powered novel-writing loom, an automatic machine for producing fiction. Whereas other poets at the time thought of the writer as a dreamer, only Scott imagined him as a machine. Abbotsford was part artwork and part creative factory. But whenever Scott was depressed or creatively stuck, he went out to plant trees or tend his flower and vegetable garden. Scott never subscribed to the more egotistical notions about what it meant to be a celebrity author. I pride myself more, he said, on my composition for Manure than any composition whatsoever to which I was ever an accessory. What I have come to love most about Scott is what a paradox he was. He seemed to thrive on contradiction. He was an international celebrity who saw through the fame game, a man of the city and a country squire, a legal brain and a romantic poet. Nothing illustrates Scott's omnivorous interests as much as his library. Over the past 10 years, work has gone on to catalogue the huge collection, revealing just how amazingly diverse it is.
I think the library is the unwritten autobiography of Scott. I mean, we can see his huge range of interests and the contents, ranging from, popular culture to very high, serious tomes.
I mean, it's not just sort of Shakespeare and the classics, is it?
Not at all, no. It's very hard to find a subject that he doesn't have a book on, in fact.
You've actually got some of the library here, which I feel in awe that we're actually getting to touch his own books. I've seen them so often behind the cages.
This is the first book of fairy stories published by the Grimm brothers that Scott wrote and asked them to send to him. Mm-hmm. Scott then sent them books in return, and this is a letter from Jacob Grimm to Scott. He wrote in German and Scott wrote in English.
That's astonishing. Why was Scott obsessed with fairy stories?
Well, it obviously came from his childhood when he was ill and he went to the Borders and was brought up by his grandparents wwho told him all the Border stories, which, may be the very beginning of his life as a writer.
Although we think of him as a sort of 18th century man of reason, he's really fascinated by things like witchcraft.
That's right, yes, he had a huge collection of witchcraft, and they were the few books that in his time he kept behind locked doors, actually. This is a manuscript, a Rosicrucian manuscript. It was probably made so it could be circulated clandestinely because they were considered politically a bit dangerous, and it has all kinds of illustrations of esoteric things. There's the Ark of the Covenant with the two cherubs, astrology and Kabbalah and alchemy.
He was almost a kind of precursor to Dan Brown in this way.
Yes, Dan Brown would be at home here.
What's this final book?
Now, this is really interesting because this is the first book that was published in Tasmania. It's about Michael Howe, who's a bushranger and outlaw.
I just love these kind of things. Narrative of the chief atrocities committed by this great murderer and his associates during a period of 6 years in Van Diemen's Land. It's almost like The Sun, isn't it? This
Yeah, there's a lot of books that are like The Sun. Scott has a huge collection of what he calls eccentric biographies. So he's very, very interested in highway women, in pirates, in people that lived on the edge of life.
Scott's day job as a lawyer and sheriff meant he was well acquainted with the less respectable and even the violent side of life. And he had a sneaking sympathy with the perpetrators. One poacher who turned up in his dock, Tom Purdy, ended up as his factotum and gardener. Violence and violent men always held a certain glamour for Scott. If any contemporary author had a collection of weapons like this in their home, then I can imagine that they would be receiving a visit from the local constabulary. You have to wonder why Scott had such a collection. Well, Scott suffered from polio as a child, and his disability meant he never achieved his genuine ambition to be a soldier. Nearly everywhere in Abbotsford, you can sense its creator's frustrated desire to be a man of action. there are one or two places where you get a glimpse of an altogether more private and tender side to Scott's personality. This is the drawing room, and it's absolutely exquisite. The wallpaper was specially made in China, and I could spend hours looking at the crowded, colourful life it contains. Scott, of course, had a taste for the exotic. He wrote novels set in Palestine and India. But if this room seems rather different from others in Abbotsford, that's because this was the domain of Lady Scott. Scott married French-born Charlotte Charpentier in 1797, after a courtship that lasted only 3 weeks. She was the love of his life. Unlike Byron or Burns, Scott wasn't a ladies' man. In fact, he was delightfully faithful. After Charlotte's death, Scott said that he had been heartbroken for 2 years. My heart handsomely pieced together again, but the crack will remain to my dying day. (1826) was Scott's very own Annus Horribilis. Haunted by Charlotte's death, he sought solace in his beautiful gardens. But this was the year another unexpected disaster struck. Life at Abbotsford would never be the same again. In 1826, Scott's London publisher lost a great deal of money after having invested in hops for ale of all things. As the publisher tried to balance the books, a dreadful secret was revealed. The whole time, Scott had been a sleeping partner in the business, and the company had insufficient capital to cover its debts. Scott found himself personally liable for £117,000. That's the equivalent, in today's money, of 5.8 million. Scott's business partners took the easy route and filed for bankruptcy, but that was an option that Scott could not countenance. If he filed for bankruptcy, he would lose Abbotsford. Scott chose not to declare himself bankrupt. Instead, he would write himself out of debt, just as he had written himself into a fortune. "My own right hand shall pay," he said. Anything to keep his most beloved creation, Abbotsford. This secret staircase was originally a playful piece of stagecraft, allowing the Wizard of the North to magically disappear from his study when unwelcome guests came to call. But it now became a necessity. Every morning, before dawn, he would come quietly down these steps, sparing his household the brutally early start that his work now demanded of him. The man who had once imagined a steam-powered loom for churning out novels now had to turn himself into a writing machine. But not even a man of Scott's colossal energies and vivid imagination could outrun his troubles. In the early 1830s, he suffered a series of strokes and was sent by his doctor to the Mediterranean in the hope that the warmer climate would help him. It didn't. His final wish was to die at home. Scott became more and more ill. He was trepanned, a hole drilled into his skull. A friend said he appeared like a man mortally drunk. At times, Scott hallucinated he was King Lear. Abbotsford had been a museum, a stage set, a showcase for new technology, a stately pleasure dome for parties and conviviality. Now it was also a mausoleum. Scott's bed was brought down here to the dining room, so that in his dying moments he could gaze out over his beloved River Tweed. Almost immediately after Scott's death in 1832, Abbotsford became a literary shrine, a place of pilgrimage. Scott's castle attracted huge numbers of visitors, including some of the greatest names of the day.
In here we've got Charles Dickens and his wife at the bottom here.
Here he is. Charles Dickens, that's Charles Dickens, and just Mrs. Dickens.
And Mrs. Dickens, yes.
Wonderful.
And then in this other one, we have Oscar Wilde's signature. He came to visit the house here.
There it is. Oscar Wilde, London, between somebody from Copenhagen and somebody from Galashiels.
Yes.
It's a pity we don't get a comment section down the side as well.
Indeed, yes.
So Jeanette, your family has a very long-standing connection with Abbotsford.
Yes, my family have been working here since 1900 actually. My great-grandfather came here to work as a forester in 1900 and there's been family work here ever since, including myself for quite a considerable time.
So when you first started working here, what kind of people were coming to Abbotsford then?
People from all over the world, America, Canada, Australia, but the surprise visitors that we had were actually Russian trawlermen. They had sailed into Ullapool and then on their days off they made their way down here to Abbotsford.
So from Ullapool, that must be a 500-mile round trip.
It is indeed.
It really shows you how highly he was regarded outside of the British Isles.
Definitely, yes.
It's the last few days before Abbotsford reopens to the public. There's a real sense of excitement in the air. This project isn't just about restoring Scott's home. In a way, it's also about re-examining his legacy. Whereas Walter Scott has remained popular and widely read abroad, at home, critics have sought to demolish him. He's decried as the inventor of twee Scottishness and Celtified pageantry. In some ways, the Wizard of the North became a victim of his own success. The spell he cast over Scottish history was so powerful that it almost became a parody. Just as Abbotsford started a craze for crow-stepped gables and thistle-topped turrets, so, it's argued, Scott's novels and poems plundered the past to build a vision of Scotland unblemished by modernity. But for me, the real question is whether, without Scott, we would have any national identity at all. I think in some ways we're in danger of losing Scott's most important message. His books and this building show us how you can own the past without being imprisoned by it. After all, this was the man who transformed the mucky farmyard of Clarty Hall into the playful fantasy of Abbotsford. As he himself said, there's nothing so easy to invent as a tradition. I think we should be rather grateful to have had an inventor of such imagination and such generosity.
Still to come here on BBC4, there's another fight for the semi-finals on the cards as the cat lovers meet the festival fans in Only Connect. That's here in just a moment. Plus, brand new drama begins at 9 with How's That?